Is there something that we think that neural data is going to reveal in the near future that we are concerned about? Because if we can specify that, then we can take action. But I haven't heard a lot of very specific, unique claims, right? There's issues with regard to re-identification and data privacy generally, but that's generally a concern I have for everything I do. And I certainly don't think that's well addressed. I don't think it's well addressed for my data now. And to me, that's the big gap. It's not that I'm not concerned about privacy for those things. It's not being well done now. And so I haven't really very clearly heard, what we are concerned about that neural data can reveal and in which context.
I think that one of the concerns that people have is that we live in a framework that's kind of implicitly built around mind-body duality and assumes a certain privilege of people's thoughts, that those thoughts will only be known if they choose to express them, and that their mind is essentially a privileged entity that exists outside of the material world. It's not the practical viewpoint that neuroscientists operate under when they're physically working with the brain and trying to decode things. Yeah, a lot of neuroscientists probably have a kind of code that they live by every day and then a code that they use to scientifically interrogate the brain. But certainly when people are developing devices for the brain, they're doing it from a very materialist perspective. And so I think some of the anxiety that I can myself express, and I've certainly heard other places, is that neural data breaks that down a little bit, and there aren't enough existing structures in place for when you can kind of break through that barrier.
What time frame do you think we'll be able to break through that?
I think we're already there, to be totally honest with you. I don't know if Reardon is correct that you can fingerprint people based on their EMG signal, but certainly there will be data that is perhaps not interesting enough to drive the cyborg applications of the future, but is enough to identify if someone's predisposed to Parkinson's or other diseases. I think that you're going to find biomarkers, and I don't think that you're going to need new technology to do that. That's something that drives my personal curiosity in BCI Ethics.
So that's really helpful, right? Because there's three different things to unpack there. So one is biomarker of disease, thought reading, and just like a fingerprint, so unique identification.
And I think thought reading isn't necessarily thought reading in the sense that grabbing a complete snapshot of one's consciousness, but simply perhaps even just being able to bin the state of mind into a convenient bin.
Which arguably, if you believe what EEG measures are supposed to be correlated with, you can do now.
For instance, you might be able to tell if an employee is not paying attention during a meeting. That's not exactly thought reading, but it's also data that employee might want to keep to themselves.
So for me, I'll say it's super helpful to actually break, because privacy is such a big word, and thoughts. These are all like such big concepts that it's really, and I think the considerations for each of the things you mentioned are worth talking about. And they're worth talking about in the context of the technologies that are being developed, because there's different technologies that are going to be able to get at each of those things in different ways, right? Are we coming at it from the medical space, the consumer space? What are we revealing, and what are the protections for those things? And where are they living? That when we go big into like thought protection and mind I feel like that's not as helpful as like going into concrete, what are the concerns in what context using which technology.
And that's actually what I'm really concerned about in current conversations, advocating about the uniqueness of neural data and that we need special regulations, that it really rests usually upon like hyped arguments about, an orientation towards mind reading. And I'm really worried about the damaging effects of that. I wish Nita Farahani was here, and I've been waiting for this paper to be published, and maybe it hasn't, I just haven't found it, but she actually did research asking American populations about their perceptions of their data and how careful they thought they should be with their data, which kinds of data they cared about. And frankly, they didn't really seem to care uniquely about the neural data at all. Didn't explain why. It might be the case that they just didn't have a sense of what it was or what could be interpreted from it, but cared a lot about breaches that would let people know their social security number, their credit card numbers, their text messages. Those are the types of things they were worried about. So I think that it's important to then link what like Anna was saying, the capability of those technologies with the types of things that are tangibly out there in the world that people are concerned about, and circumscribe within the ability of what those technologies can do now. The reason I still think that even early on we need to take extra care and consideration with neural technologies, though, is because it's just another technology that's apprehending a unique kind of information that will likely get better and not worse. And I think if you get in the habit of not worrying about it and just giving your information, all kinds of information all the time, and you think it's fun and don't really think about other implications, then I think that it can be damaging later because we won't have seen the possibility of what could happen when you have more detailed information. And part of that is related to biosensing in the real world around predictive brain health and a number of things. Being able to use sensors and accelerometers and all kinds of data that people are actually freely sharing now through Apple Health agreements. Apple is turning into a health company, but it's just a fun thing taking their steps and helping them lose weight or whatever else they think. I feel like there's not enough awareness and communication about the possibility of what those technologies are. And it may be the case that nobody cares too, and I also suspect it's going to be different. In fact, this is what I study is culturally. And to your point of this mind-brain-body dualism, in fact, my research has shown that, in fact, scientists and doctors in neurology and psychiatry are really strong dualists in their practice and in the way they see patients and in how they stigmatize them too, and how they make assumptions about their care. So scientists aren't really different, even if they're on the nuts and bolts. Even those who profess that they are not that explicitly and have the vocabulary to say that will still in their work manifest in that way. So one of the things I was actually trying to do was interview for particular unique disease that I was working with. I was interviewing colleagues in East Asia who have a baseline philosophical historical orientation around oneness, and that is around the mind, brain, and spirit are actually one entity and inseparable. In fact, there's not even the vocabulary to suggest that they're separate. While I ended up landing mainly with professionals in the space that are working as neurologists, psychiatrists, or scientists, I really didn't get to move into talking to community. And what I learned, though, was that there is this kind of allegiance to Western ideology and training in medicine and science that's even eclipsing some of the traditional medicine offerings that a lot of these countries had. So there was being infiltrated with that kind of bias as well. It's interesting, but as far as the privacy bit, though, that seems to be oriented not necessarily around just mind-body dualism or collectivism or individualism, but is actually more oriented around the history of those words. So privacy in Chinese and in Japanese, the original translation is shameful secret. So why would you need to have one? Whereas Western, trajectory of the definition has been one more about celebrating your ability to present yourself as you want, and that is considered something that later was called a right. I think as technology evolves on a global scale, those kinds of considerations will have to be put into place.